Welcome to the deep dive. We are opening up a really remarkable set of sources today. They map out something pretty complex, a cosmic, legal, and theological strategy.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
This isn't just, a simple story of morality. It feels much more like an analysis of sovereignty, jurisdiction, even the divine requirements for claiming ownership and completion in the universe.
That's absolutely right. These sources, they present a really compelling argument. They suggest that the whole path of human history, especially this huge struggle we see between, let's say, divine intention and chaos, it's fundamentally a battle rooted in these concepts of dominion and stewardship.
Dominion and stewardship, okay.
So our mission, really, for this deep dive is to meticulously trace the steps. First, how the original manager, the first Adam, how he lost his temporary authority over earth, lost it to the adversary Satan.
Right, the initial setup.
And then second, how the second divine person deliberately stepped in, taking on this role of the last Adam, to execute a very specific, almost preordained plan. A plan to reclaim, restore, and ultimately, well, perfect creation.
It almost sounds less like theology in the traditional sense and more like, I don't know, a detailed account of a celestial corporate takeover and then the legal recovery plan.
That's a good way to put it, actually. It has that kind of legal strategic feel.
So we absolutely have to start right at the beginning, the point of initial assignment, back at Eden. The sources really zeroed in on Adam's mandate in Genesis 2.15. What exactly was the job description that came with the planet? It had to be more than just, keeping the weeds down, right?
Oh, much, much more. The text says Adam was placed in Eden to manage and keep guard it. Now, the sources we're looking at make a really crucial distinction here.
Okay.
This wasn't absolute fundamental ownership. Adam was granted something we might call delegated stewardship, or maybe agency authority. His role, which was established back in Genesis 1.28, included ruling over the animals. But that command to guard or keep the garden, that's the key element these sources really focus on.
Wait a sec, guard. That word implies... Well, it implies an existing threat, doesn't it? Or at least the possibility of one. You don't normally tell someone to guard something unless there's a potential danger.
Precisely. That's the inference. If there was absolutely nothing to guard against, the instruction seems a bit redundant.
Yeah, unnecessary.
So the sources interpret this creation mandate, specifically the guarding part, as almost an implicit military or defensive instruction. Adam was, in a sense, the head of security for the entire human project and the physical realm that was entrusted to him.
Head of security.
Yeah. And this role included the responsibility to maintain vigilance against external threats. Specifically, the strategic attack we know was coming from Satan. Adams was essentially given a warning, maybe not explicit in its details, but implied in the command, and he had the necessary means to prepare.
And the stakes, set up right there in Genesis 2.17, they were existential. It was life or death. Obedience meant guaranteed life, continued stewardship. Disobedience meant death, the loss of everything, including that role as manager.
Exactly. That obedience was the fragile yet absolutely necessary condition for holding on to that temporary dominion. The moment the temptation arrived, presented by the serpent in Genesis 3, it targeted the very core of Adam's created status.
How so?
The lure was becoming like God, right? Possessing independent knowledge of good and evil. This was a direct challenge to the whole principle of delegated authority. It was suggesting Adam could operate outside his mandate, be his own source of knowledge and authority.
And, well, we know how that turned out. Adam failed that test. And the sources argue that the immediate consequence wasn't just moral guilt, it was a kind of legal surrender, an involuntary loss of that agency authority over earth. Why was the loss of stewardship so immediate, so total?
It comes down to the nature of sin, according to this view. Adam's choice made him, as John's Gospel and Romans put it, a slave to sin. And the sources emphasize a crucial point. A slave cannot manage the property of his former master. By choosing disobedience, Adam lost his moral and spiritual integrity. And with that, he lost his legal standing to manage God's creation on God's terms. The authority to govern, it requires freedom and integrity. And Adam, well, he retained neither once he broke that fundamental law of love and obedience.
So this becomes a critical legal transfer point.
Why?
By corrupting and then dominating Adam, who was God's designated manager, Satan essentially seized the operational management keys to the planet. Is that the idea?
That's exactly how these sources frame it. And it explains why we see Satan in the New Testament making such incredibly bold claims. Remember when he tempts the last Adam, Jesus, in Luke chapter 4?
Right, in the wilderness.
He shows him all the kingdoms of the world. It says they've been handed over to him. He can give them to whoever he wants. According to this interpretation, that authority wasn't seized in some direct cosmic battle with God. It was gained derivatively, by legally claiming control over the designated steward, Adam, who had forfeited his rights through disobedience.
That really reframes the fall, doesn't it? It
Yeah.
wasn't just a personal moral lapse, it was a cosmic security failure, a breach that allowed an enemy power to basically assume the operational governance rights of Earth.
Yes, and if we dig a bit deeper into the sources, Satan's motivation seems twofold. It goes beyond just simple jealousy or rebellion.
Okay, what else?
He sought to use Adam's failure to validate his own core theological argument, his contention against God, which was that God's commandments are fundamentally impossible, or at least too heavy, for created beings to actually keep.
Ah, so if Adam fails.
If Adam fails, Satan can argue, see, your law, the requirement for perfect obedience, it's arbitrary, it's unjust, creatures can't actually do it, thereby undermining God's entire sovereignty and his legislative authority. It was an attack on the very character of God's rule.
Wow. Okay, that transitions us perfectly into the next major section, section 2. This deals with a huge theological principle, the idea that God actually controls every temptation. Because if Adam's trial was manageable, we have to understand why every trial must be manageable. Let's try and unpack this concept of manageable trial.
Yeah, this is fundamental to the whole argument. The foundation here is absolute divine fairness. It's encapsulated really well in 1 Corinthians 10:1-3, that famous verse. God won't allow any creature to endure a trial they cannot overcome. He always provides a way out.
Right, I know the verse, but the sources argue this isn't just a comforting thought, it's a non-negotiable principle of God's sovereignty.
It's exactly non-negotiable.
Why? Why couldn't a creature just occasionally face something truly insurmountable?
Because think about it. If a creature faced a trial where obedience was literally impossible, spiritually, physically, whatever, God would instantly forfeit the moral right to command love or obedience from that creature.
How?
Because the command itself would be rendered inherently unfair. If I command you to do something you cannot possibly do, my command loses its moral force. So, to command love, God must guarantee the possibility of performing that love, even under the most extreme duress. This requirement, this necessity, is why God has to control the boundaries of all temptation and suffering.
Okay, that makes sense. It preserves God's righteousness as a lawgiver. Which means, going back to Adam, his failure wasn't about bad luck or being overwhelmed by an unfair circumstance.
No.
It was entirely about his choice. He was placed in a situation that was, by divine guarantee, manageable.
Exactly. And the most vivid biblical illustration of this principle that the sources point to is the book of Job. Specifically, Job chapter 2, verses 6 and 7. God says to Satan, regarding Job, "Behold, he is in your hand, only spare his life."
Right, setting a clear boundary.
That passage acts almost like a scriptural benchmark for this principle. It demonstrates that Satan, even when allowed to inflict suffering, can only act within strict, explicit, divinely set boundaries. Satan might propose the attack, he might be the agent carrying it out, but God sets the perimeter. And he sets it in such a way that the trial remains, at least theoretically, manageable for the person involved. Job could still choose faithfulness.
That provides the crucial context. But let's loop back to Eden specifically. Our sources get into some really fascinating speculation about the mechanics of how God related to Satan's temptation of Adam. They lay out 4 theoretical possibilities. Let's walk through those, because understanding why they reject 3 of them is key.
Right. This exploration is really helpful for understanding the difference between God's, let's say, permissive will and his commanding or active will. It's a tricky distinction, but important.
So what's the first scenario they consider?
The first scenario is that God issued an explicit command not to tempt Adam, which Satan just flat out disobeyed.
Okay, simple disobedience.
If this were true, Satan would be solely responsible for initiating the event, and God would almost be surprised by the disobedience. But this runs counter to the understanding of divine omniscience and omnipotence. God isn't caught off guard, and the sources argue Satan's actions are always ultimately contained within God's sovereign plan. So they reject this scenario because it seems to undermine God's active control over events.
All right, so that one's out. What about the third and fourth scenarios? These involve God more directly, either explicitly permitting or even commanding the temptation, which then leads to the curse.
Scenarios 3 and 4 are also rejected, but for a different reason. They risk making God the direct author or instigator of evil. Well, if God explicitly commanded the temptation, that's scenario 4, then God himself is the direct initiator of the event that leads to Adam's spiritual death. That violates God's perfectly just and good character. If God explicitly permitted it with a warning of the curse, scenario 3, that gets closer to the likely reality, but it still doesn't quite capture the nature of Satan's own self-determined criminality in the act. It makes it sound a bit too much like God set up a trap.
Okay, so if 1, 3, and 4 are out, that leaves the preferred conclusion, scenario number 2, which is...
Scenario 2 suggests that God gave no explicit instruction either way regarding the temptation itself. He simply did not prevent it. He allowed Satan to act on his own accord, his own wicked initiative. Why is this model seen as the most theologically sound?
Yeah, why this one?
Because it seems to best balance divine sovereignty with creaturely responsibility, both Adam's and Satan's. The source uses a parallel, interestingly, with the slaying of Jesus. Think about John 19, when Pilate boasts about his power to release or crucify Jesus.
Right, Jesus says, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above."
Exactly. Pilate and the Jewish leaders, and Satan behind them, acted on their own initiative, driven by their own motives, malice, fear, political expediency. They chose wickedness. It was their self-determined will to murder Jesus. But that power, that authority to act, was only operative because it was permitted from above, within the boundaries set by God's overarching redemptive plan.
So, applying that back to Eden, Satan acted on his own initiative, choosing evil. It was his desire to tempt and effectively murder Adam spiritually.
Yes, it was his self-determined crime.
But this action, though completely criminal on Satan's part, was permitted to occur only within the boundaries God allowed, boundaries which ensured the trial remained manageable for Adam.
Precisely. Satan chose the wicked path, and yet God, in his sovereignty, allowed that choice to play out, knowing he could ultimately use it for his greater purposes. But crucially, the boundary condition was that the trial could not be intrinsically insurmountable for Adam.
Which leads us straight back to the verdict on Adam's failure. Since the trial was manageable, Adam's defeat wasn't forced upon him. It was solely due to his own choice.
Yes, the sources are quite firm on this. Adam failed to heed the implicit warning in that command to guard Eden. He failed to prepare adequately, failed to recognize the threat, and failed to fight the attack when it came. This wasn't, according to this view, a test of strength against some overwhelmingly superior being. It was fundamentally a test of obedience against a deceptive fellow creature.
And even though Adam failed his test, the source is careful to emphasize Satan's distinct crime in the situation. It wasn't just about tempting.
Yes, that's a critical legal footnote, you could say. Regardless of God's permissive will in allowing the trial to happen, Satan committed an act of homicide. Spiritual murder, as Jesus calls him, a murderer from the beginning in John 8:44.
How is it murder?
By deliberately luring Adam into the spiritual death, the separation from God that inevitably led to physical decay and death, Satan violated the fundamental divine law prohibiting murder. Think 10 Commandments, you shall not murder.
Okay.
Therefore, the curse that God pronounced upon the serpent in Genesis 3, verses 14 and 15, wasn't just a consequence of the general chaos. It was a specific, just judgment for a distinct criminal act, the crime of homicide committed against Adam. Even if Adam was guilty of disobedience and failing his stewardship, Satan was separately guilty of murder.
That structure, Adam's failure, Satan's crime, God's sovereignty, it really sets up the massive scale of the conflict that follows. It becomes this epic battle over who has the right to manage the earth, and it clearly requires a resolution that's legal, moral, and ultimately sacrificial.
Exactly. It's not just about forgiveness. It's about restoring rightful authority and order.
Okay, let's move into section 3 then. We need to explore the fundamental ownership issue that really underpins all of this struggle for management.
Yes. Before we talk more about management rights, we absolutely must anchor the discussion in an immutable fact presented strongly in these sources. The earth, all of time, all of space, it belongs exclusively and fundamentally to God. Psalm 50 says, "Every beast of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills." Job 41, "Whatever is under the whole heaven is mine."
So God isn't just the original owner who handed it over, he's the current owner and sustainer.
Absolutely. Colossians 1:16 is key here. It says that in him, through him, and for him all things were created, and importantly, in him all things hold together. He's actively sustaining everything, down to the atomic level right now and into the future. That fundamental ownership is never, ever ceded, regardless of who might be claiming management rights or causing chaos within the system.
But the operational management day-to-day, that's clearly compromised. That's where Satan operates, right?
Yes, but how he operates is crucial. He operates primarily through enslaved humanity. He rules the world system not by direct divine mandate, but by exploiting the sin of the original manager and his descendants. Ephesians 2:2 talks about the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience.
Ah, so Satan's influence isn't his own inherent power over the planet, but rather his power over the disobedient managers.
Precisely. It's a derived authority stemming from humanity's fallen state. This corrupted management, however widespread and powerful it seems, does not negate or diminish God's ultimate fundamental ownership of everything.
That distinction is absolutely vital. It's like God owns the entire corporation, the building, everything. But the corrupt head of a department, originally appointed by a now demoted manager, has seized control of that department's operations and is running things his own destructive way.
That's a very good analogy. And the sources emphasize that God didn't give Adam the earth to manage however he pleased. He gave it to him with a specific operational guideline, the law of love.
The law of love is a management contract.
Yeah. It was intended for nurturing, for guiding creation toward its ultimate fulfillment. You see hints of this in prophetic visions like Isaiah 11, the wolf dwelling with the lamb, that kind of harmony. It wasn't meant for abuse or destruction. So the sin, the failure, wasn't just about eating a piece of fruit. It was a fundamental violation of the law of love, the core principle of management. And that resulted in the mismanagement, the corruption, and the abuse of the delegated inheritance.
This raises a really profound question, then, about free will itself. If the law of love is the standard, why couldn't Adam and why can't created beings generally, it seems, keep it perfectly in their hearts? This points towards some deeper limitation inherent in created beings, doesn't it?
Yes, and this might be one of the most challenging concepts in these sources to really wrap our minds around. The argument is that created beings cannot keep the commandments perfectly in their hearts with total, unreserved love until they achieve a deep, almost experiential comprehension of God's own perfect, self-sacrificial love. 1 John 5:3 hints at this. This is the love of God, that we keep his commandments. And his commandments are not burdensome.
Not burdensome, but they feel burdensome without that full understanding.
Exactly. Lacking that ultimate insight into the nature of God's love, creatures remain bound by the ultimate consequence, the ultimate fear inherent in finite creaturely existence, the fear of death. Hebrews 2:14 speaks of those held in slavery by their fear of death.
Oh, okay. So the fear of death acts as a constant underlying constraint on perfect love. If I fear losing my existence, my love for God and others can never be absolutely total because self-preservation will always, somewhere deep down, place a limit on my obedience or sacrifice.
Precisely. Perfect, completed free will. The kind of freedom where one's rational choice aligns totally and joyfully with the law of love seems impossible, according to this view, without a revelation of love so profound, so complete, that it actually conquers the fear of death itself.
Wow.
And the sources assert something quite radical here. If a creature could somehow perfectly obey the law, inwardly and outwardly, in their heart and actions, without needing the ultimate revelation of God's love demonstrated, for example, on the cross, well, that creature would essentially be demonstrating eternal qualities. They'd be independent of God's redemptive work in a way. They would almost cease to be a mere creature.
So Adam's failure wasn't just a lapse in moral judgment in that moment. It actually exposed this inherent limitation of creaturely free will before the ultimate demonstration of divine love. He was operating, in a sense, on an incomplete understanding of what perfect love truly demanded and made possible.
He certainly had the capacity to obey the specific command, given that's why his trial was deemed manageable and his failure culpable, but he did not possess the ultimate perfection of will, the kind that transcends the fear of death entirely. Therefore, the whole drama of redemption that follows is designed not merely to, say, correct a mistake or pay a penalty, but to elevate the creature to a higher state of existence altogether, to perfect free will by eradicating the fear of death through love, thereby eradicating the very possibility or likelihood of future sin.
That is a fundamental reframing. The last Adam, then, wasn't just coming to clean up a mess. He was coming to complete the original creation project and perfect the creature in a way Adam never could have on his own. Which brings us squarely to Section 4, the actual strategy of restoration. If the first Adam lost the management rights, how does the new claimant get them back? It seems he had to enter the system in a very specific way as both creator and creature.
Yes, it's the ultimate paradox, isn't it? The second divine person is the creator. He's the one sustaining the entire cosmos, as Colossians 1 and Hebrews 1 tell us. But the plan, the strategy, required him to become a creature. Philippians 2 describes this beautifully emptying himself, taking the form of a servant. He voluntarily relinquished the exercise of his full rights and privileges as creator-owner to assume the status of a creature heir, as Hebrews 1:2 puts it, whom he appointed the heir of all things.
Why? Why the absolute necessity of becoming a creature? If the earth was always fundamentally his anyway, why couldn't he just exercise divine authority, a sort of cosmic eminent domain, and just wipe out the usurper, Satan?
Because the goal, according to these sources, wasn't merely to reclaim lost property. God never lost fundamental ownership. The goal was to legally vindicate the righteousness of his law and, crucially, to redeem the creature who had become enslaved. And to do that required operating within a specific legal framework. The sources point directly to the legal framework of the kinsman redeemer found in the Old Testament, particularly in Leviticus 25.
Okay, let's pause there. We absolutely need to define kinsman redeemer, the goel, in Hebrew, because it seems like the absolute legal crux of this entire strategy.
Absolutely. It's central.
Yeah.
Under ancient Israelite law, if an individual fell into severe poverty and had to sell his ancestral land, or even sell himself into servitude or slavery,
Right.
the nearest relative, the kinsman, had the specific legal right, and often the duty, to step in and buy back the land, redeem the inheritance, and purchase the freedom of the enslaved relative, redeem the person.
So 3 key things for the kinsman redeemer. He must be a relative, a kinsman, he must be willing to pay the price, and he must be able to pay the price.
Precisely those 3. Now apply that to the cosmic situation. If God had simply acted in his raw power as the creator, he wouldn't have fulfilled the kinsman requirement. He wouldn't be the relative.
Yeah, he had to become human.
The last Adam had to fully participate in humanity, take on human flesh, become our relative, our kinsman, to legally fulfill that requirement. And the price necessary to reclaim the inheritance, the stewardship of earth that Adam had effectively sold through sin, and to free the enslaved first Adam and his lineage, humanity, from bondage to sin.
Right.
That price was the death of the last Adam himself. Isaiah 53:5, the punishment that brought us peace was upon him. Romans 6:23, the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life. His life paid the debt incurred by the first Adam's failure.
This makes that confrontation in the wilderness when Satan tempts the last Adam an incredibly tense, almost legal showdown, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It is the precise moment the usurper, Satan, confronts the rightful heir, Jesus, who's now operating under the legal constraints and identity of a kinsman. Satan, still apparently convinced he holds the operational management rights that were handed over.
Yeah.
He actually tries to bargain with the last Adam, Luke 4 again, demanding worship in exchange for the very authority that the last Adam already fundamentally owns and actively sustains as creator.
That is just sheer cosmic arrogance. What do the sources say about that specific maneuver by Satan? Is it seen as just foolish?
The sources we looked at pretty much describe Satan as being utterly mad or deluded for making such a claim in actual presence of his creator. It demonstrates his total self-deception, his blindness regarding the true nature of authority versus delegated management. And think of the implications. If the last Adam had succumbed, if he had worshipped Satan,
He would have broken the law of love himself.
exactly, he would have violated the first and greatest commandment, become enslaved to sin just like the first Adam, and in doing so, he would have tragically validated Satan's original claim that God's law is impossible for a creature to keep under pressure. The whole plan would have collapsed.
But of course, the last Adam was sinless. He resisted perfectly, which meant Satan couldn't corrupt him, couldn't dominate him like he did the first Adam. So, what was Satan's next move, realizing that corruption and deception were completely off the table with his opponent?
Since deception failed, Satan really only had one strategic option left if he wanted to try and maintain his influence and prevent the redemption: murder. He had to eliminate the rightful heir. Jesus himself tells a parable in Luke 20 about the wicked tenants who say, "This is the heir, let us kill him, that the inheritance may be ours."
So Satan thought, if I can just kill this last Adam, I disrupt the plan, I prevent the redemption, I secure my management rights permanently.
That seems to be the logic. He thought that by orchestrating the execution of the last Adam, he would permanently thwart God's plan. But, and this is the genius of the divine strategy, this very act of violence, the murder of the innocent last Adam, paradoxically became the precise legal means of Satan's own ultimate and decisive defeat. Hebrews 2.12 says that through death, Jesus destroyed him who has the power of death, that is, the devil.
Because that death was the exact price required for the kinsman redeemer to pay the ransom. Satan was essentially manipulated or forced into providing the very legal currency needed for his own defeat.
It is the perfect strategic trap, the ultimate irony. The murder of the innocent Savior simultaneously satisfies the debt of sin accrued by the first Adam, and it proves the ultimate possibility of perfect obedience to the law of love, even unto death, thereby completely vindicating the law itself.
Okay, let's stay on that point for just a moment. Proving the commandment's truthfulness. How does the cross specifically achieve that vindication of the law of love?
The cross is the ultimate demonstration that the law of love, which fundamentally requires placing God and neighbor above self, even one's own life, is not only righteous but possible to fulfill, even when facing the ultimate threat, death. So it's John 5.3 again, his commandments are not burdensome.
And Jesus embodies that in John 15.13.
Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. The last Adam demonstrated this perfect self-sacrificial love to its absolute maximum extent. And this perfect obedience, rooted in love, not fear, overcomes that fundamental fear of death that holds other creatures in bondage, as Hebrews 2.14 says.
So, by conquering the fear of death through perfect love, the last Adam achieved that perfection of free will, something the first Adam, limited by his pre-cross understanding and inherent creatureliness, never possessed.
Precisely. The law stands fully vindicated. It's not some impossible burden imposed by a harsh God. It's revealed as the very definition of perfect freedom and perfect love. And because it's vindicated, it remains the righteous standard. It becomes the standard of judgment for those who ultimately reject the love that was revealed through the cross. John 12.48, the word that I have spoken will judge him on the last day. The entire system is legally flawless. The debt is paid. The Redeemer qualifies. The law is proven true. The inheritance rights are secured.
But the victory wasn't immediately and completely executed, was it? Not the moment he resurrected. The sources seem to emphasize that there are still final steps needed to fully claim and implement the inheritance. Which leads us, I think, into section 5 and the really profound symbolic imagery we find in the book of Revelation.
That's exactly right. The last Adam, having accomplished the central decisive task on the cross, is described in Hebrews 10 as having sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time until his enemies should be made a footstool for his feet. 1 Corinthians 15 says he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. So there's a process, and the legal documentation for the final transfer of that secured inheritance must still be processed, must be executed. And that's where Revelation chapter 5, with the scroll sealed with flint seals, comes into play.
Okay, the famous sealed scroll. The sources interpret this scroll not just as, say, a book of future events, but as specific legal documentation required for the complete restoration of creation. Why is it sealed? And why is only the Lamb, the one who is slain, found worthy to open it?
It's sealed because the contents represent the execution of the final phases of the redemption plan. And only the one who actually paid the price, the kinsman redeemer who was slain and is now alive, possesses the legal authority, the standing, to break the seals and execute those final steps. The scroll, according to this interpretation, actually represents two distinct but closely related legal documents. Both are necessary for the final transfer and restoration.
Okay, let's break down those two documents. What's the first one, or the first legal instrument contained in that scroll?
The first is likened to a slave certificate. This document pertains specifically to the first Adam and his descendants, that's humanity. It represents the legal record of humanity's enslavement to sin and corruption due to Adam's fall. It must be opened, unsealed, to officially and finally free humanity from that bondage. Romans 6.18 talks about being set free from sin.
So opening this part of the scroll triggers.
It initiates the final judgment process against sin itself and against those unrepentant individuals who have persistently defiled the creation. Revelation 15.1 speaks of the final plagues completing God's wrath. Legally, this act terminates the curse on the human body, the effects of sin and death, leading ultimately to the transformation into the promised spiritual, perfected body described in 1 Corinthians 15.44. It's essentially the universe's emancipation proclamation for the enslaved creature, humanity.
Okay, that covers the human element. The second document within the scroll must then relate to the physical realm, the inheritance itself.
Correct. The second document is interpreted as the land title deed. Opening this part of the scroll legally restores the earth's dominion, its management, to its rightful steward under the authority of the last Adam. This act formally ends the curse that fell upon the physical land because of Adam's failure, reversing the environmental chaos and decay introduced by sin. It ushers in the new heaven and new earth described so vividly in Revelation 21.1.
So you have the redemption of the people and the restoration of the place. The slave certificate frees the inhabitants. The land title deed restores the territory. Both require the unique legal authority of the Lamb to execute because he paid the price for both.
Precisely. It's complete legally grounded restoration.
Now, this whole massive legal process unfolding over time highlights a specific element that occurs during this waiting period before the final seals are broken, the role of the martyrs. Why do the sources suggest there's a specific decreed number of martyrs required before these final steps, like the first resurrection, can actually occur? It seems sobering.
It is sobering, but it connects directly back to Satan's original argument, his core challenge against God. What was it? That God's law is impossible for creatures to keep, especially under the ultimate pressure, the threat of death. The martyrs, in this framework, serve as the final, irrefutable body of evidence presented before the cosmic court, you might say. Revelation 6, verses 9 through 11, speaks about the souls under the altar crying out, and they're told to wait until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be complete, who were to be killed as they themselves had been.
So their martyrdom isn't viewed as just a pointless tragedy or even just a personal act of faith. It's actually a necessary strategic component of the legal case, an act of witness.
Yes, it's presented as the ultimate legal proof. Their freely chosen death, a death chosen out of love for God and faithfulness to His Word, rather than out of fear of the world or death itself, fully proves the truthfulness of the commandment. It demonstrates that creatures, empowered by God's grace and love revealed in Christ, can love even unto death, echoing the perfect witness of the last Adam himself, John 15:13 again. Their collective sacrifice completes the body of evidence required to fully and finally expose Satan's foundational argument that the law is unjust or impossible as an absolute lie.
And once that specific decreed number is complete, what happens next according to this framework?
The first resurrection occurs. Those who participate, identified in Revelation 20 as those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and the Word of God, and who had not worshipped the beast or its image, basically. Those who overcame the fear of death and proved the law's possibility through faith and love. They inherit the promised 1,000-year reign. Yes. Revelation 20, verses 4 and 6, says they come to life and reign with Christ for 1,000 years. They act as priests and kings, participating with the last Adam in the ongoing consolidation and administration of the now secured new creation. They receive portions of that redeemed inheritance directly from the last Adam. This reign seems to be part of demonstrating and confirming the secured status of the new creation before the final wrap-up.
Which brings us, finally, to the ultimate goal of this entire vast cosmic battle, the completion of free will. How does the victory of the last Adam, combined with the witness of these martyrs, permanently eradicate the very possibility of sin cropping up again in the perfected creation? That seems like the final guarantee.
It's the ultimate guarantee. When the law's truthfulness, its inherent goodness and possibility, is fully and experientially proven first by the last Adam's perfect life, death, and resurrection, and then confirmed by the willing, loving witness of his followers, the martyrs, the universal understanding of God's perfect love and righteousness fundamentally transforms the creature's capacity for choice.
Okay, but are you saying that God literally removes the ability to choose sin? Or is it that the perfected creature simply becomes incapable of rationally wanting to make that choice ever again?
It's presented more like the latter. The freedom of choice, the mechanism of will, likely remains. But the rational motivation for choosing sin is completely consumed, completely eradicated. Why? Because the core deception of Satan, his lies that creatures can achieve satisfying independence apart from God, you will be like God, or his lie that God's law is an unfair, impossible burden, is fully undeniably exposed as a total catastrophic falsehood.
So with the full knowledge of God's perfect self-sacrificial love now fully revealed and understood, and having witnessed the devastating consequences of turning away from that love, the perfected creature's free will always, consistently and rationally chooses righteousness and love.
That's the idea. Completed free will is characterized by this absolute, fearless love that has conquered death. It's the end state where sin, and even the realistic likelihood of future sin, are entirely consumed. Not by divine force removing choice, but by the perfection of knowledge, understanding, and love making any other choice utterly irrational and undesirable.
So it's the universe finally secured. The whole cosmic drama, which was tragically initiated by the first Adam's failure to guard his delegated trust. It finally concludes with a universe secured forever. Secured by the last Adam's perfect obedience, validated by the willing, loving witness of his followers, and achieving a state of being, a state of perfected will and communion with God that is actually far superior, far more secure than the one that existed even in the original Eden.
Exactly. A creation not just restored, but completed and perfected.
That is a truly phenomenal, comprehensive outline of this intricate strategic framework. Just to recap, We started with the first Adam, given this temporary delegated stewardship, a stewardship he unfortunately forfeited through a failure of obedience, even though the threat he faced was, by divine design, manageable.
Right, and we established that God's absolute sovereignty controlled the boundaries of that threat, ensuring its manageability, even while Satan remained fully culpable, fully guilty for his own criminal act of spiritual murder.
And that initial failure, that loss of management, necessitated the incredibly specific plan of the kinsman redeemer, the creator himself, becoming the creature, our relative to legally buy back both the inheritance, the earth stewardship,
Okay.
and the enslaved relative, humanity.
And the currency for that redemption, the legally required price, was the substitutionary death of the last Adam. His death effectively purchased both the slave certificate, ensuring human freedom from sin's bondage, and the land title deed, guaranteeing the earth's eventual restoration.
And then, the final piece of evidence in this cosmic legal case, the witness of the martyrs. Their sacrifice demonstrates beyond any possible doubt that perfect love, empowered by God, truly does conquer the fear of death, and that fully vindicates God's law, exposes Satan's core argument as a lie, and secures the completed, perfected free will of the redeemed creation for all eternity. It resolves Satan's original accusation against the justice and goodness of the law completely and forever.
It ties it all together. And perhaps the most profound takeaway from digging into this complex set of sources is seeing how the terrible detour caused by Adam's failure was ultimately incredibly utilized by God to demonstrate the deepest truth about existence itself, which is that the law of love, when it's finally and fully understood and experienced through the lens of God's own perfect self-sacrificial love revealed in Christ, it isn't a heavy burden at all. It is, in fact, the very mechanism by which created beings achieve true, lasting, completed freedom, guaranteeing eternal righteousness, joy, and peace.
And that leads us perfectly to our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to maybe mull over today. If this entire cosmic structure, this whole plan, guarantees that the absolute maximum test God ever allows any of us to face is ultimately only the threat of death, a threat which these sources argue is made entirely non-frightening by perfect love flowing from him, then what relatively minor trials might you be facing right now? What smaller fears, anxieties, or desires are perhaps holding your will hostage today, preventing you from stepping into and exercising the completed freedom that has already been secured for you? Something to think about as you go back into your day.